Hi all, so welcome to the Progress Conference of 20. My name is Ellie Anderson and I will be the moderator of this session. So if I pass over to Georgia, who'll introduce herself and introduce the session and tell you such an important session as today is.
Brilliant. Sorry, it was coming up saying I wasn't allowed to unmute quite sensibly as we were being kept muted. Hello, everyone. I'm Georgia Gould, leader of Camden Council, and it's really brilliant to be here for this important conversation about what the pandemic has told us about inequality. And to be part of this amazing conversation. It's been such a great morning. I'm feeling quite hopeful, which is not something I've been very familiar with recently. But you know, to be having this kind of wide conversation about where we want to go as a party and what our vision for the country is, I think is so important. And this issue that we're talking about here it is critical, and I think the pandemic has shone a light on the depth of poverty and inequality in our communities. And my own borough that Camden people often talk about as you know, being home of a metropolitan elite or somewhere of great wealth, but it's also a place where there is extreme poverty, where 40% of children grow up in poverty. And at the start of the pandemic, one of our primary schools, which is 2 minutes from Google's headquarters and, you know, some of the wealthiest countries in the world, we found that 70% of the children there didn't have access to a device to learn at home. And the experience of the pandemic was very different. If for some of our community who were living in overcrowded housing, you know, young people who were sharing a room with 4 siblings and weren't able to access the opportunity that they should have been able to. And I think we also saw that the way the pandemic had a disproportionate impact on our Black and Asian communities, and how it exacerbated the depth of inequality we already saw in our communities. And I think that the poverty, the jobs and the economic crisis will be as serious as a public health one. So it's a really important conversation that we're having today, and I'm really delighted to be joined by some amazing panelists to help us shine a light on these questions. So introducing them, Thangam Debbonaire, who is the MP for Bristol West and shadow leader of the House of Commons, Rebecca Montacute, who's the Research and Policy Manager at the Sutton Trust, and Daniel Johnson, who's the Labour and Cooperative Member of Scottish Parliament for Edinburgh's Southern and Shadow Finance Secretary. So real range of views across the country and on different topics. So excited to hear from them. So I think I'm just going to start off by asking each of the panelists to kind of give your perspective on the question we're here to discuss around inequality and the pandemic, and what your reflections are on, as we kind of, fingers crossed, start to move forwards, and what your reflections are on what the pandemic has told us about inequality. So starting with you, Thang.
Thank you, Georgia, and thank you, everyone. I think that where I want to start is actually rather gloomy, which is that we had gross levels of inequality that had been rising rapidly for 10 years before the pandemic. And the pandemic was made worse by them and has made them worse. So, for instance, if you were living in overcrowded housing, or housing that was hard to heat or drafty or expensive, you were much more likely to be able to be unable, to isolate effectively if you got symptoms or were diagnosed. You were much more at risk of symptoms being exacerbated. You were much more at risk of having the virus transmitted to you and from you. So those are just some very basic things about just picking one policy area of housing, which I was in until very recently, where both poor quality housing making the virus worse, and then as a result of the inequalities in how people were treated. So if you were like me and you were told to go home, you could go home, and here I am on my laptop, I'm in front of the ubiquitous bookshelf. Those are genuine books, but for many people who are doing the poorest paid jobs with the insecure work, were unable to do that. They had to keep going. So of course they were more at risk. And they were the ones often who were living in the poorest quality housing, who had the poorer quality health. So all existing inequalities were made worse by COVID, and we come out of COVID, if we are out of it soon, which we're not yet, in worse shape. And this ought to be bread and butter for us as Labour politicians and Labour members and Labour campaigners. This is who we are. This is what we're for. So it is time for us to do what we do best and not let the Tories act like they're on our turf, because they're definitely not. And I think here's the Tory attack thing from me is the Tories are going to try and act like they're the ones who do inequality now. And it's just rubbish. And we know it's rubbish, because if they really believed in tackling inequality, where have they been for the last 10 years? Making it worse. If they really believed in tackling inequality, they'd understand what that stupid phrase levelling up means. And they don't understand what it means. They don't have a deeply felt, understood, lived experience on the ground understanding of what it might mean to give everybody genuinely equal opportunities. And they don't have a deeply held understanding of why it matters, which is that it's better for all of us. So I think we've got lots to talk about today in terms of what we need to do as a Labour Party, but also how we need to show up the fact that the Tory party are charlatans on this. And that's certainly part of my job in opposing Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Sorry, I'm just asking Daniel to unmute at the moment.
Okay, I can unmute.
There we go.
Would you like me to give my 10 cents worth?
If that's okay, Daniel, please.
Of course, of course, of course. Well, look, I mean, we are, I think, at quite a critical moment in time. We are approaching the point where we are looking forward towards the vaccination program concluding, life beginning to go back to normal, and as Thangam pointed out, we are transitioning from potentially transitioning from the health crisis to the economic one. And I think that, that is going to be, getting our politics right through this is absolutely critical, both for us as a party, but actually for the country as a whole. Because I think how that economic challenge is understood, the solutions to it, I think will probably actually set kind of the political running for the next decade or more. I mean, I think we all know and get angry with that tired old credit card analogy for the public finances. We are going to be entering into a very similar phase in terms of the economic recovery. And let's just be clear to us about how perverse the economic situation we find ourselves in is. While we may well have avoided the absolute worst outcomes of kind of the greatest economic slump in centuries, that the effects of that have been very unequal, and they've probably been masked. So while we are going through this slump and looking at how we approach the future, house prices have continued to rise. The wealthiest have actually seen their disposable income go up. And yet we know that situation of economic benefits has not accrued equally across the country. And indeed, so we've just come through the Scottish Parliament elections, and as ever, you end up with one or two conversations you have on the doorstep absolutely seared into your memory. And I had one with a chef, and I knocked on his door, and he said, "The problem is none of you are talking to me, none of you, not Labour, not SNP, not the Conservatives. You keep wanting to give free stuff to all these other people, but you're not helping me. Furlough's been fine, but don't tell me that it's been perfect. I'm £8,000 down on my salary this year, and I'm struggling to run my car." And I think that, in a sense, in a nutshell, is the reality that people are facing. But the wealthier have got more money, have been spending it all on kind of electric guitars and things for all the hobbies that they've been picking up with all the time that they've been spending at time of lockdown. And there's others who have essentially been struggling to make ends meet, seen their incomes reduced, and indeed, don't have the luxury of being able to work from home. So I think in a sense, the crudest sense of the inequality we're approaching is defined by those who have been able to continue to work and work from home, and those who have either who've been furloughed or indeed are now back at work, but have to leave their house to work. And I think that is probably going to be the sharpest divide. And we have to think about how we approach that, how we ensure that people have opportunities through work as they approach work. Because let's be clear, not just do the Tories want to steal our clothes around inequality. I think there's a much bigger danger, and that's around nationalism. So in Scotland, what we see is the SNP presenting an independence referendum, independence as the solution to recovery. You need independence, according to them, in order to deliver recovery. And it is nonsense, because we all know that constitutional change is long, complicated, and costly. It's taken us 5 years for the disaster of Brexit to unfurl and be delivered. Independence would be worse. Nor do they have any answers to the key questions around currency or how you set up a state. And yet they blithely present independence as the solution to recovery. And I think that added to the Conservatives attempting to steal our clothes, the use of identity and nationalism is definitely something that the Conservatives are doing and using as a ploy, frankly, to distract from the reality. So absolutely, we must focus on inequality. That is our mission. That is why our party exists. But we have to, I think, develop a better, more direct language that appeals to the realities of the things that people are struggling with. The fact that they have less money than they might have wanted. The fact that they are being presented by their employers with new terms and conditions and forced to agree to them. And the fact that they are essentially, many people will have to accept whatever work they can. They probably did before, but that situation is even going to be even worse. So let's not let the Conservatives or the SNP distract people with the lie of nationalism and identity as a substitute for tackling the deep-rooted inequalities. So we need to find a language and a policy program that deals with those things directly in a way that people can see the clear difference it will make. That's our challenge. That's what I hope we'll talk about this afternoon.
Thanks so much, Daniel. And we'll go on to talk a bit more about that political challenge. And I think you're absolutely spot on. But before that, I wanted to introduce Rebecca to talk a bit about the inequalities that we've seen in education.
Yeah, so the organisation that I work for, the Sutton Trust, we've carried out research throughout the pandemic on every level of education, looking from the early years through to schools, apprenticeships, university, and then looking at the impacts on access to the workplace. And I really can't stress enough that every single part of that journey has been impacted by the pandemic. And looking at each part, it's been those from the poorest backgrounds who've had the largest impact. So looking at schools specifically, obviously we know in normal times that schools are not equal, educational outcomes are not equal for all children, but the kind of differences we've seen during the last year and a bit has been something of another scale altogether. So for some children in the very kind of best of circumstances, you can imagine the very first day that schools went remote, their school straight away was able to put in place live lessons. They had a quiet room in their house to be able to work in, and their parents were able to support them with that. And their educations were not completely undisrupted, but compared to some other children, they had, relatively quite a good time, were able to access learning quite normally. Then if you look on the other end of the spectrum, whilst the government did provide a large number of laptops, it's likely it didn't meet the full need and was actually quite late in terms of a lot of the delivery. And many students will have been living in cramped housing conditions, as already mentioned, with multiple siblings trying perhaps to share a phone even to work on, where they never had access to a laptop, where their school didn't do live lessons because most of the students wouldn't have been able to access them. And that kind of gulf in experience is really considerable. Looking only after the first lockdown, there's an estimate that actually the last 10 years of progress in kind of reducing the gap in attainment between the best off and the worst off has likely been reversed by what has happened. And obviously we've seen even more kind of impacts from further school closures and people missing time, even during the time that schools were fully open because of bubbles bursting and everything else. And then that's going to go all the way through to what happens with exams this year. There are really big concerns that while teachers will be able to make some kind of adjustments for things they weren't able to teach their classes, that actually there's no individualized marker for learning loss to be able to say to universities or employers, this person had really considerable disruption, they couldn't learn during this time. And we're really concerned about what's going to happen to those young people for their kind of next destinations. And then just looking at the wider kind of economy going forward, when there are fewer opportunities in the economy and there are fewer jobs going for people, we know that it tends to be those with the connections and know-how who are able to access the small number of opportunities that do exist. So we're worried going into the longer term that you're going to end up seeing a reduction in social mobility. And I think the real question for every political party at this point is, how do you respond to this? The huge scale of learning loss for some of those young people and the inequality and how it has impacted those young people is going to have an impact potentially over the rest of their lifetimes, with a cost of in the billions of pounds in terms of the impact it has on their kind of ability to earn that economic output going forward. So putting in a large amount of money at this point actually has the opportunity to save you a much bigger amount of money in the longer term if you actually help children to catch up now rather than wait and see the full impacts of this.
Thanks, Rebecca. And I think, as you say, there's a huge recovery to come from this in terms of children and young people, and as they go into employment, some kind of extreme pressures we're seeing on youth unemployment. So I wanted, so to everyone that's watching, please do ask questions. We want this to be a conversation, so put all of your questions in the chat. But I wanted to kind of build on the points Daniel was making about how we have a conversation about poverty and inequality, because I think that the need we're seeing is extreme. And I knocked on a Durham polling day, and I met somebody who'd never been on benefits before, had lost her job, but had kind of bills had mounted up, and she was literally had her kind of computer open to take a loan out from a payday loan. And I think we're seeing people kind of come to terms, I think, with how precarious our economy is, and the extent of poverty. In London, I think it was 63% of people before the pandemic who were in poverty were in working households. So I think the government is often trying to talk about poverty as a kind of niche issue, but it is something that poverty and insecurity are widespread. But we just, for those who were watching the conversation earlier, there was some interesting polling that showed, firstly, that poverty wasn't as high on people's agendas as other issues, but also that poverty was much more important to Labour voters than it was to those who'd voted Conservative, that we need to win back. So how do we have this conversation? How do we cut through when talking about these issues, and how do we connect into people's daily lives? So Thangam, I'm going to come to you first to say a bit on that.
I think that using the word poverty often alienates A, the very people we're trying to help, and B, the people who don't think it applies to them. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't use it, because it has a technical meaning, and we need to understand, if we're politicians who want to change it, we have to know what we're talking about. Now, if we think we can change something without actually defining what it is, then we're wrong. But I've not found generally many people who are poor who like being called poor. And I think that's a mistake. If we fall into that trap, I think that's a mistake. I think it's paternalistic in all the wrong ways. And I think that rather than use that language, we need to talk about unfairness. We need to talk about being able to play your part, being able to fulfill your potential, and actually people's aspirations for their sons and daughters. My constituency, Bristol West, it really typifies some of the educational inequalities that Rebecca described, in that I've got some of the richest parts of the country and some of the poorest. I've got the poorest ward in the entire southwest in my patch, where people who live in tower blocks didn't have access to the laptops, or not enough of them. They had one for a whole group of a family of children, of 4 or 5 children in one very small flat. Their internet wasn't good enough. They didn't have access to outdoor space. They didn't have access to people who could help them out. They were struggling, as Rebecca has described, with one phone. But if I'd gone along to them and say, oh, this is because you're poor, that wouldn't have helped them. I think they told me that they felt they'd been treated unfairly, and those parents in particular battled. And in the end, we got them some laptops from various businesses, but that shouldn't have been how it was done. I mean, this was months after Gavin Williamson had promised the laptops and promised that the digital divide was going to be closed, and it didn't happen, and it didn't happen. And I think that that's got to involve working with and alongside people. Not just saying, I know it's in vogue, isn't it, this morning? I've heard a few people mention this phrase, that we can't just tell people what we think the problem is and how we're going to fix it. It's got to be showing people that we understand the problem from their point of view, listening to them and being willing, and not ready to jump in and say, oh, that's because you haven't got a laptop. Like the parents on my Zoom call in that particular area who were logging in from their smartphones to tell me about their frustrations with their children. They didn't need me to tell them what the problem was. They knew what the problem was. They wanted to work with me on what the solution was. But I also think there's something tricky that we're going to have to think about, and I wonder if we could bring this into the conversation, which is the increasingly transactional nature of voting, where people are seeing, if I vote for you, what are you going to give me as an individual? And I think that's challenging for us as the Labour Party, when what we do when we're in government is make big changes, and that an awful lot of people's memory of what those big changes are is now quite faint because it was 11 years ago. I mean, in 2011, those elections in the early 10s, we could say to people, do you remember the education maintenance allowance? And do you remember Sure Start? Well, a lot of that people have either forgotten, or it's no longer part of their lived experience of us. So I think there's a couple of challenges there for us. And the solution to that, I think, is by making sure that the campaigning we do is all year round. I'm a great believer in all year round campaigning, and that at this point in the electoral cycle, it needs to be willing to knock on doors and listen to people telling you about what their problems actually are and how they want to solve them. And that this is nothing new. This is not particularly revolutionary to say this, but actually not just knocking on doors to talk about votes, which I know nobody on this call, I'm sure absolutely nobody does that ever. But while that is still a perception, I think that we need to make sure that members feel encouraged, involved, supported to work alongside councillors, MPs and MSPs and members of Senedd across the country to do more of that stuff. And one of my campaign memories, which stands out in my mind, is helping to elect an amazing woman for the Senedd to take a seat off Plaid, who had been who was the community centre. She knew everybody. So that's the sort of thing I'm talking about, where instead of just doing to people, we're actually doing alongside and with people.
Brilliant. And I couldn't agree more. And I think that, as historic loyalties, kind of we move away from that kind of model of politics, really, and more voters are swing voters and are going to be looking at what we have to offer at that election. That provides both a kind of challenge, but also an opportunity. So Daniel, I'm going to come to you with the question Thangam posed, is as we move to that kind of more transactional kind of relationship around voting, how do we make sure that we frame these issues in a way that really appeals to people?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm tempted just to say a big ditto to literally everything Thangam said. I mean, I think first and foremost, I think the most important thing is we're finding different languages is really important. If we constantly talk about poverty, it's not going to work. Frankly, and let's not find another catch-all phrase either. It doesn't really work, and it does make people feel that fundamentally we're looking down on them, or that they just don't identify with what we are saying and what we're offering. So I think, first of all, I actually think we need to be putting it in very positive terms. So I'd go a little bit further than talking about fairness. I think we need to talk about opportunity. It's where actually the Tories are being quite clever by calling it levelling up. It's about actually giving you something more rather than talking about what you don't have. And I think that's really important. So the language is important, but we just need to get with the politics of transaction. And frankly, we've been here and we've done it before. And yes, some of the more sort of nuanced and detailed policies that we've talked about in the past or delivered in the past, may not hit the mark, but others have. I mean, our biggest single, campaigning policy in the lead up to the 1997 election was the minimum wage. It was a big, bold, transactional policy, if you want to put it in those terms, but absolutely tackled wage inequality. So I think we need to be thinking about in those terms. So thinking about, first of all, language that is about actually, I think providing people with more, providing them with opportunity, better chances, and I think we can do that. But then we need bold policy to back it up. Not long shopping lists, but clear policies. Whether I think that's around support for training and retraining for those that find themselves out of work, kind of more proactive investments or support for job creation programs, whether it's sort of big programs for So I think one of our opportunities is when you're doing this right, you can do more than one thing at once. So one of the the policies that I was very pleased with in our manifesto in Scotland was a pledge to within 10 years get all homes to category C energy efficiency. That deals with the climate crisis. It makes people, it enables people to heat their homes more affordably, and it creates a huge number of jobs. These are the sorts of things that we, so we go, look, we know that you want more opportunity. We know that you struggle to find the work that you want. Here is the thing that will do those things, in clear terms. Is thinking about how we have delivered this in the past. Thinking about things like the minimum wage. I think these are the sorts of both in terms of language, but bold policies that we need to think in terms of.
Thanks, Daniel. I mean, this is in danger of being very much a ditto conversation, but I couldn't agree more. And I think that the kind of potential of a Green New Deal to deal with the climate crisis, but deal with the fundamental issues of social justice and the reality that people are struggling to heat their homes. And I think sometimes we put lots of different names on poverty: food poverty, fuel poverty, digital poverty, but the issues that sit underneath that are that the incomes are not going far enough to meet the basic needs that people have, and anything we can do to address that as part of a broader our broader agenda around meeting the climate crisis is so important. Now we've got lots of questions coming through, which is brilliant. We were going to try, I mean, I know this might be a bit too much for us given I couldn't even unmute earlier, but we're going to try and bring some people into the conversation to ask your questions. But if you'd rather not do that and you're, in your pajamas, just want to put them in writing, that's fine. So just indicate if you'd rather not come in, otherwise we will try and bring you into the Zoom conversation. But before we do that, I want to come to you, Rebecca, and to maybe say a bit of, we've been talking a lot about the experience of young people, and I suppose how do we ensure that young people are really leading that agenda and telling their telling their own story about the change they want to see? And is there anything from your research that is coming up about the experience that young people are having in terms of education and some of these issues?
Yeah, so I just add a tiny bit to the previous conversation about the discussion of poverty first, if that's okay, just to say that I think one of the really important things from the pandemic and something we need to take forward, all of us, is that a lot of poverty actually has been much more visible to the average person than it had ever been previously. So from my point of view, thinking about things like the digital divide, that was always there. There were always kids who were going home and couldn't do their homework because they didn't have a laptop or the internet, but people have seen it in a way that they never would have previously. And I think there is an opportunity there to think about that going forward. In terms of understanding the experiences of young people more broadly, so the Sutton Trust has actually just recently been commissioned to help to run with UCL a very large study looking at the experiences of young people in year 11 this year off the back of the pandemic. So it's going to be 12,000 year 11 students in England, and we're going to be following them hopefully for years to see what the impact of the pandemic has been on them. So we're really hopeful that that research, and please keep an eye out for it, will kind of give people an idea of what the actual experiences have been for them and what it means for them when they start going into the workplace and through that, their kind of early careers as well. So that's going to be a really important place. I think as well, just, yeah, not assuming that you will already spot all of the problems. One of the things that I think hasn't had enough attention has been some of the challenges actually that university students have had. And while there's been quite a lot of discussion about things like how boring Zoom lectures are and all of that kind of thing, I've seen much less about actually the financial struggles for a lot of those students. So obviously a lot of the places that students tend to work, things like hospitality, retail, have been some of the most heavily impacted sectors. And for poorer students, they're actually the ones, whilst all students tend to work broadly a similar amount, students from poorer backgrounds tend to work because they need it to meet their cost of living, as opposed to doing it just to be able to afford kind of extras and holidays and things. And I think some of those kind of issues haven't been coming to the fore enough, and we need to make sure young people are being listened to so that those challenges are being recognised and actually acted upon, because I haven't seen enough of that so far.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point to bring in. So now we're going to go to Tim, who had a question about gender inequality and care and the importance of care. So Tim, over to you.
Thank you for the opportunity to contribute, and thanks everyone for a really interesting conversation so far. I think one of the additions I wanted to add is we've seen in terms of inequalities, as we know, as a result of the pandemic, that it's had a disproportionate impact on women, and especially women who have children, working women, and we've always had a divide in unpaid care at home in particular, and domestic duties, but we've seen a disproportionate increase in that, as well as increases in gender-based violence and a whole range of other challenges. And I think one of the things that it poses for me is, what is Labour's response to that? What do we say in terms of the fact that in many ways that we've had some successes, and the government has had some successes in its response to COVID, but it's been pretty kind of gender blind, if I want to call it that. And so how do we kind of rebalance that? And I think one of the key things that Labour really doesn't talk about is, how do we get men more involved? And so parental leave is a key example. So we only have 2% of couples take up parental leave. And we know from evidence that men not stepping up to take that, because often they can't afford, because of the structural challenges, has a direct impact on women's access to the workplace. So how do we think about gender equality as a movement, both in terms of that disproportionate impact on women, but also how we shift norms in society in terms of men's role? And I think we have a positive, and thinking about emotion that was just talked about earlier by Anwas, I think that is really an important place. And I just made a separate point as well, and if I can just say quickly, in relation to the conversation about the world of work. And I do think the world of work is really changing, and that's creating a lot of inequalities for people who work through online retailers, and we see that I'm in Southeast London, and there's a huge impact on people having to work for Deliveroo and elsewhere. So I think we need to also think seriously with the trade unions about what we have to say for people who now their jobs are purely through online retail. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tim, for that question, and I think you're absolutely spot on. And actually, childcare is one of those really important issues that I think unites people around the country, and is a broad issue that can appeal and is important for Labour. And then we've got, I'm going to take a few questions together. So I've got actually a question from Tom, which talks a bit about work and builds on that last point that you made. So Tom, do you want to come in? Tom Canham. Well, just while we're finding Tom, I'm going to go to Shama before we go back to the panel. Shama.
Thanks, Georgia. Maybe an odd question coming from someone from London, but I suppose inequalities around rural versus urban, and trying to, if we're really going to make headway into some of our rural areas, which have huge issues around inequality around transport, for example, how can we seek to address that? Because actually that's going to be something that's generational and has been long-term coming. And friends who I know from the southwest, from up north, from other parts of the country, talk about transport and rural versus urban inequality, and how does the Labour Party actually look to address that? Because that's something that I think is growing in terms of concern.
Brilliant, thanks, Shama. And Tom, did you want to come in, or I'll just ask the key bit of the question? Right. So
yeah. So my question relates to the world of work again. Obviously, COVID kind of highlighted just how much we could change the office environment with a much larger focus on working from home. But younger people in particular live in shared housing with poor internet connection, and quite often they're being forced into roles that don't offer that opportunity and that progress going forward. So I was wondering how, as the Labour Party, we can speak to the older voters in particular who want to work from home and have the facilities to do so, while also providing opportunity to young people to be able to access that opportunity going forward.
Thanks. So a range of questions there. And so to the panelists, don't feel you have to answer all three, but just maybe pick out the one that really speaks to you. And we'll go back, starting with Daniel. Oh, you're muted now, Daniel. I'm so glad someone else did that.
Yeah, I think you're bound to that at least once in one of these sessions. Look, let me pick out just a couple. First of all, the gender inequality points are really important, I always feel like I should go and ask my wife to answer this question for me, because I am constantly mindful about the pressures that it's not easy, and it. I think this is something that we tackle. I think the difficulty is that I think some of it is really cultural, but I think there are some policy things we can do. So, I mean, I personally, would like us to have a very bold pledge around wraparound childcare for school-aged children. I think a lot of the childcare policy focuses on preschool, and actually a lot of the challenges for working parents is actually school-aged children. I think guaranteeing everyone a place at breakfast and after school clubs would make a huge difference. I certainly, around where I am, every school has those things, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're guaranteed a place at them. I think there are some things that we could do around that. I think also looking at particular sectors is really important, and which leads me into the next point. Is I think looking at precarious work is, I think, one of the most critical things that we can do. I think it relates to the gender point, because we know that women are more likely to work in certain types of employment, and that very often more precariously. But then I think that leads into this point around kind of people working for online retailers, gig economy. We have to have some bold pledges. I think we have to commit to legislation, so that people working in these sectors have full employment rights, rights to holiday, right to sick pay, etc., etc. I think I would go further. I think we need to look at, it's not just about kind of casualized employment. I mean, even more broadly in retail, there's a lot of bad employment practice, not just 0 hours contracts, but sort of 20-hour contracts, but kind of requiring employees to commit to making themselves available, essentially meaning that they have to commit to a very precarious form of employment. I think we need to a bold legislative commitment to actually improve working rights, or indeed grant them in some instances, both around conditions but also importantly pay, because we have seen a massive erosion in terms of this since we left power, and I think we need to put that right when we do get back into government.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And Tim, you got thumbs up from Tim, so that's brilliant. Rebecca.
Yeah, so I'll come back on the world of work point first, and then I'll talk about early years, if that's okay. So in terms of the questions of the world of work, I think for young people specifically, there's some real both opportunities and challenges in terms of the changes we're likely to see post-pandemic. One of the real opportunities, if we're having kind of more remote work, and that is something that is recognised in way more companies and is an option for people, and this links a little bit to that kind of urban rural question as well, is that people who don't live near a big city, largely often London, actually could have access to many more opportunities than they do at the moment without having to leave their kind of home and go somewhere else. And in terms of allowing social mobility and making sure that everyone everywhere has those opportunities, that's actually a pretty great thing, and something that we should look at having the flexibility of going forward. but also equally, there's a lot of concerns about young people having access to the kind of training and mentoring that you can get in person in the office. And especially if you are not from a kind of background where your parents have kind of not had, say, a professional job and you're trying to break into those kind of industries, not being able to meet people who are in those industries face to face to build up your own networks and make sure that it isn't just the people who already have those networks from their parents, family, school. That's a big potential concern as well. And that's something that employers really need to look at going forward to make sure in the post-pandemic world, we're not accidentally actually worsening those inequalities. And I'll just say a very brief bit, if that's okay, on childcare, which is one of the things, again, I don't think has had enough attention during the pandemic, is actually the financial precarity it's put a lot of early years providers in. So many of them were already in quite difficult financial situations because the amount of money they get from the government for the 3 hours of childcare actually doesn't tend to cover their costs. So there are some real struggles there for those providers. But they've lost a lot of their normal business during the pandemic. Originally, the government was paying a lot of it, but there's been some changes over time. And there are real concerns for a lot of providers now that actually they aren't going to have enough funding to keep going forward. That's especially the case in the most deprived areas. We did polling and found that providers there were much more worried about having to shut. And that's a real concern for women, obviously, who need it to be able to access work. And especially that those in the poorest communities actually could end up being the worst hit by those providers actually closing and just not being available at all. So that's something as we come out of the pandemic, we really need to be mindful of and do work to correct.
Thanks. And I
oh, she's lost us. She's muted herself.
hello. I think so I think if everyone could mute who's not speaking, that'd be brilliant. I think that the point about care is spot on, and it goes across child and childcare and adult social care, and you know, care jobs should be really good quality jobs that pay properly. They're some of the most important jobs we have in our society, and it's where there's huge need for new jobs, but we see our communities put off by coming into those jobs because of the pay and the conditions. So kind of where we go with the future of care in our country is one of those fundamental questions. So Thangam, I'm going to come to you to.
Thank you. I'm just going to pick up on the question Tim raised about gender inequality. Ever since 1913, when a group of women from the Cooperative Women's Guild, who'd campaigned really, really hard for there to be a maternity allowance and for it to be paid, revolutionary idea to the women, and they sat in what I think was Committee Room 14 and watched all the Labour MPs vote against it because they said it was an insult to working men. It's a real reminder of the fact that there's always been revolutionary women in the Labour movement who worked really hard, who then said, damn it, we're going to have to get elected as MPs. So instead of being on the audience side of the barrier, we're actually on the committee. But you know what they found? When they did get elected, they were told many times, we'll get round to gender equality. First of all, we need to sort out socialist revolution. There's a whole wing of us in the Labour Party who believe in the Labour Party as the single greatest political institution the world has ever known. But we are also sometimes very frustrated by the continued struggles of women 100 years on from when those co-op women sat in Committee Room 14 and got frustrated. For a lot of us, that's why we're in politics. I've got, you know, so many other things I might have done with my 50s, and I ended up going into politics because I was just fed up of waiting for the question of gender equality to come to the top. And so I'm glad that men are raising it. One thing I think you have to do is to follow Daniel's example and go and ask his wife and then listen, because what typically happens in the Labour movement is we get asked and then we don't get listened to. And that doesn't mean there aren't strong women in the Labour movement. Evidently there are. Here we very are, loads of us who have got good positions in the Labour Party and councils and parliament and all the rest of it. But we still typically have to wait and put our hands up before we can get some of these issues raised. How do we fix it? Men, you need to step up. You need to talk to each other. You need to not talk over us. You need to not take up space in discussions about gender equality when we need to talk, but then you need to go off and talk to each other about it and what you're going to do. And you need to start seeing it as something that benefits you. This was my job for 10 more years before I became an MP, working with men on gender inequality. I worked with men who were violent to their wives, and literally the best way of getting them to change their behaviour was to see that there was something in it for them. And once that stopped depressing me, it actually invigorated me, because life is better with gender equality, and it is better for men. It really, 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 really is. And the sooner men start seeing that as something that just maybe is partly your problem to fix and shouldn't just be our problem to raise, we're all going to be better off, because it's no accident that a lot of those jobs that women get stuck in are the jobs that we've just been talking about needing to raise the status of. Care jobs, early years, those are the sorts of jobs, cleaner jobs, where people are congregated, women are congregated, concentrated, and it leads to this circular argument about, well, there's no point doing X or Y because women earn less and therefore they might as well be the ones that take time off when they have children, and therefore what's the point of paternity leave? And you end up with a really cyclical, self-reinforcing argument. So yes, please go talk to each other about what you're going to do differently, and identify for yourselves, without us having to blame it all the time, although quite happy to help, why it's going to be better for everybody. And the Labour Party is the party to do this, by the way. We really are. We can do this.
Well, an absolutely brilliant call to action, Thangam. So we've got 3 minutes left. So I'm going to go to the panelists and kind of get your tweet answer on what do you think the most important policy agenda for the Labour Party to focus on in tackling inequality is, in a way that, you know, that talks to voters. So I always hate it when I get that question on panels. I get to ask you. So Daniel, I'll come to you first.
Pay and working conditions. I mean, it really is as simple as that. We want people to get better jobs with better pay and better conditions, and we need to have policies that speak to that in very direct terms.
Brilliant. Rebecca?
I'm obviously going to say something about education. I think every single parent cares about their child having equal opportunity to succeed. And I think making sure that the long-term impacts of the pandemic don't end up affecting this generation of young people the rest of their lives, having a really good policy offer of what the Labour Party will do to actually help with the inequalities that have arisen because of the pandemic in education. That would be my ask.
Brilliant. And Thang?
I'm just going to introduce a slight note of maybe not disagreement exactly, but I don't think it's about individual policies. I think someone said this earlier on today, it might have been Bridget. Policies aren't really what gets us over the line and gets us into government. It's people believing that we can actually enact them. We can have loads of policies, but people mostly, in my experience, including Labour volunteers and Labour voters, don't read the whole manifesto with a pen. I think we need to be listening to people and showing them that we've got the values. We do need the policies, by the way, because we need to get into government and enact them. But we need to be showing people that we get that the bread and butter stuff of, do you and your kids have a decent job? Do you have hope for the future? Is your aspiration for your child that they will do well at school and be able to get a decent home to live in and a decent job? Does that look likely? Yes or no? And do you believe that the Labour Party can help you? Those things are enduring. They were the same in 1913 as they are now. The way we do them is different. The way we enact them is different, but still those overarching things, I think those are the things that matter most. And then the individual policies that come underneath them, I think we've got a lot of work to do, because we definitely need to know how we're going to do it. But what's going to actually win us the election and be able to tackle those inequalities is getting people to believe that we and they can only do it if we mean it, that we genuinely are listening to them, working with them, and campaigning alongside them for a better world. Oh, and climate change, but you know, that's another discussion.
Oh, that was wonderful. I love that challenge to the question, because you're absolutely right. It's our values. It's and as Anas was saying, you know, the politics of emotion and how we show people that we really care and can change their lives. So what a brilliant discussion. And I think I think we pretty much kind of started to set out a really exciting agenda for the future, a way that talks about the kind of urgent need to change things for the way that people are really struggling, but to do it in a way that isn't patronizing, that stands alongside people and supports them to change their own lives and their community. So thank you for the amazing, passionate and brilliant speakers, and for all of the questions that came in, and let's kind of help Progressive Britain to set out this agenda for the future and make this real, so we can win the next election. Thank you.